Hello everyone, today we talk about Peukestes army. We will make a series, or at least this is comprehended on the broader one, on Hellenistic warfare, however about the armies of the single Diadochoi, and in this sense specifically the immediate successors of Alexander, other than just eventually the military of the kingdoms, of the empires that they formed. In turn, we already made something about the Seleucids, more than one video about the Antigonids as well. And Peukestes is I wouldn't say a relatively little known figure, because at least, who has studied the story knows him because of his role as satrap of Persis, and his persophilia, let's say, that you can discuss whether it was kind of realpolitik or maybe also some, I don't know, cultural, personal inclination from the man. And Wu had, in fact, this, yes, still minor compared to the, more powerful Diadochoi role in fact, in southern Persia, but still, an important strategical one in balance, as he probably contributed also to the defeat of Eumenes, and was a man of great renown, of great prestige, because of his military deeds, for which Alexander and the other Macedonian generals recognized him as one of the most decorated heroes in the Macedonian army. We know little about him before those occasions. We know he was native of the town of Medza in Macedon, so he was a hardcore Macedonian. In fact, even his name sometimes is rendered as Peucestas or Peukestas, which is a Dorian dialect. Actually, his name would be Peukestes, and he, he's first mentioned historically as he was appointed to command of a trireme on the Hydaspes River, and by that time he surely would have, already been a commander of some importance, and so that Alexander already trusted because of his capacity and expertise. And he was selected by Alexander himself to carry before him in battle the sacred shield, which the king had taken down from the temple of Athena at Troy. And Peukestes distinguished himself specifically in the assault of the capital city of Malavas in India. And there are many, he was credited with saving properly Alexander's life. And while different authors tell the episode in different ways, with different characters, other things, the fact that Peukestes was the hero of the situation recurs in every single account, and so that's quite credited. So already during Alexander's reign, he was made satrap of Persis, so at Persepolis proper, and at this point Peukestes was already part of Alexander's bodyguard, the Somatophylax. And at this point, he took control of the area. He would remain based there fundamentally throughout all his life until the Battle of Gabiene, when he was taken prisoner and brought in Phrygia. And he was at Susa, rewarded with crowns of gold because of his past exploit, and he and that's where he began properly to adopt Persian dress and customs, right? So that he was considered as a Persophile, as opposed to the alternative, properly traditionalistic Macedonian side. And on this, we don't know much more. We only know that he performed his duty as a satrap in 323 BC. As a matter of fact, he contributed with 20,000 Persian pantodopoi for Alexander's army that he joined at Babylon. And that Alexander, before dying, was essentially planning the invasion of Arabia in that context. So Persis was just, facing the Persian Gulf. Next, you had Geraya in the face. Across sea, you had Geraya Arabia. So Peukestes surely had an important strategic and logistic task there, aside from the troops that he fielded. It's probable that these 20,000 men were also trained in part as phalangites, right? Which is a thing that we discussed. We made a video. We never talked much about Alexander's army, but specifically about the Seleucids and the Syrian and Mesopotamian and Persian participation to the Seleucid army, probably also to the phalanx per se. So we will talk about the Pantodapoi in a while. And so he seems to have been particularly connected to Alexander himself, as he seems to have been, close to him at the moment in his last days, fundamentally one of the few at least, and that eventually, after Alexander's death, he was recognized the government of Persis without problems, right? In the first partition, then again the one of Three Paradises in 321 BC. And he seems to have been a quite ambitious individual, at least a crafty one. There is a swinging historiographical opinion on him, because we know too few to actually even assess his capacities. But let's say he sought to extend his power as much as he could, not differently from anybody else at the time, and starting from a relatively, what would appear just as a relatively defined position, because Persis was not that much large, but factually, especially during the war between Antigonus and Eumenes in 317, as he joined the latter, he fundamentally, at least was attributed control of all the satrapies east of the Tigris River. So in theory, all that laid east to Mesopotamia, so not just Persia, but also the various territories towards India and Central Asia that, where the Macedonians had conquered. And actually, things were more complicated than this. I don't think we have even properly any, reason to believe that he would manage to, even at some point, to even claim an actual sovereignty over all those lands that were still, however, ruled by other satrap. But let's say the political influence is boundless in practice, and he's stuck to Eumenes' side even at the Battle of Gabiene near Gadamarta in 316 BC, where he was confronted. They were confronting Antigonus at that point, and it seems that this was a defeat of Eumenes, and it seems that Peukestes actually had something to do with that, something of a betrayal, because as far as we understand, he was on the left, just next to Eumenes, and so a prestigious position. It also shows his political importance, reflecting in the battle array, or maybe the same Eumenes feared some treachery, and Peukestes managed to, come out at least of the struggle. He was captured anyhow. Eumenes, was surrendered by the Argyraspids, and he owed his the misconduct and insubordination to Peukestes, and and at this point, Peukestes' career ended, in the sense that Antigonus captured him. But since Peukestes was a man of prestige, and after all, didn't have much power at that point, he simply, was leaving prisoner, but with some good quality of life in Phrygia, where he seemed to have been living for a very long time. Still, it seems he was born in I think 370 BC, and people say that by the time of Demetrius Poliorcetes was still around, so we are in the 90s of the 3rd century BC. So he might have lived at least 70, 80 years, which for for the time, not much for the agent itself, but being have a Macedonian general between war, destroyed liver because of chronic alcoholism and other things, wasn't quite. It was quite a feat indeed, not very likely in the first place. So this is just a bit of detail about the man. Today's video, as you see, is dramatically short because it's not that you can't really tell much about Peukestes' army. There are many more interesting things about the other Diadochos' army that we will see, but for the sake of completion today we talk about him. So as we've seen, there is this 20,000 Persian troops contingent fielded for Alexander, and later on he seems to have had among his troops 10,000 Persian archers and slingers, 3,000 men of mixed origin, then Pantodopoi, that were essentially a force of natives that were armed and trained in Macedonian style, and given that Peukestes ruled in Persis, these were mostly Persian, with Macedonian officers and perhaps file leaders as well. 400 Persian cavalry and 600 Hellenic and Thracian horse. These being settlers left by Alexander, from whom Peukestes had also undoubtedly raised his small agema, so his elite picked unit of 300, less than 300 men actually. So that's all we know as far as I've found about Peukestes' forces, and so we can just comment briefly on what this means. First of all, this considering the above mentioned 20,000, that would seem to account for a great part of the invading force of Arabia under same Alexander's command. This 10,000 Persian archers and slingers also quantitatively are, making you pose some questions, because at the time of the Arabian expedition before his death, Alexander had already had to disband fundamentally most of his Macedonian phalanges, right? And this was partly due to, of course, the demands that the same veterans had made to Alexander, about the mutiny in India, Alexander's frustration, and so on. His main goal was India, right? Strategically, yes, he would have subjugated Arabia. Probably he would have conquered Carthage. The Greeks of southern Italy would have probably simply, accepted his suzerainty at that point, and then he would have directed to Persia, as the Indo-Gangetic plains were the most obvious goal, right, objective to seize for an empire like Alexander's one. So we know how it's gone. I can't, I don't think we have the specifics about those 20,000 many in the first place that Peukestes brought with him to Alexander, but let's say it's more likely orientatively for those to have been phalanges properly, rather than these other troops that we see now in the forms of archers and slingers, which however tells us something interesting about the local the Persian military culture. Also, we say Persia, but if you look at the Iranian plateau, it's a pretty big and complex thing, also ethnically speaking, in terms of the various, there are not just Persians in the Iranian plateau in the first place, ethnically speaking, but properly there are different influences that derived from the surrounding populations and so on. So Persis by itself being on the Persian Gulf in the south of the plateau, etc., was a strategically significant area because naturally, from there you could control part of the sea. There was, it was arguably just passing through the territories of the Uthians and Gedrosia, you would reach the Indus without having to cross some greater mountain chains, for example, the ones of Arachosia, etc. He was very close to Arabia, to the Hormuz Strait, also very close to the mouth of the Mesopotamian rivers, and that was a major, it just faced some of the major maritime routes with Far East Asia and so on. So actually an important area, Persepolis, and in all its great Achaemenid tradition, and so on. But it's still a small area, and yet we see so it's actually not an area. So you see, we talk about the Persians, and we like rightly to stress, as we've seen in many videos on the Achaemenid army, etc., the let's say the importance of equestrian, of mounted combat in the first place, chariots, cavalry, and the connection that the Achaemenids as Medians, as Scythians fundamentally, since the origins had in this waves of nomads that invested in more civilized Middle Eastern sedentary areas, whereas Persis is from the direct opposite side. And so when we see this 10,000 among archers and slingers, considering the territory also heavily mountainous and so on, you'd think mostly of infantry rather than cavalry per se. Naturally, these regions, were not short of, demographic resources. They weren't maybe overly populated, but they were still rich, and so we can't say, this necessarily represents only what, let's say, a general levy, independent from any kind of doctrinal, specific strategic consideration would reflect the local native warfare. But still, archers and slingers are important. They show how the local military culture was importantly infantry based, other than just like more equestrian, like in the north. Then we have 3,000 men of mixed origins, the Pantodapoi, by the way, that are these, the meaning, it would be, if not properly coming, but say pertaining to everywhere, right? So people that could be employed in any military function, let's say, and it refers to the native troops of the Adochoi states that could be trained in different ways. Most of the times just as banal militia, like literally, a guy with a spear and a shield, nothing else. Other times they could be trained properly in the phalangitic Macedonian style, right? And we don't know by which extent. I think, as we were saying before, this was the case. There were naturally different ways of war. We don't have to give for granted that the phalanx per se was just the only option that a Macedonian general / veteran like Peukestes was politically strategically obliged to use, right? Even though the Macedonians were absolutely and rightly proud of their military tradition, and the phalanx at that point would become the standard of military superiority of Western civilization up until Roman times fundamentally, and so there was a lot of pride attached to it. And as we've seen also in the video on the Syrians, Mesopotamians, and Persians in the Seleucid army, the initial ethnic division between the Macedons that were settled in military colonies and the locals would gradually be surpassed in some way. If anything, also because the Macedonians married into the local women, etc. But it was something broader. Of course, in Seleucid times that went on for a while, lots of things changed. So in this beginning, you would expect a more rigid division that you see here in the Agema, that was drawn from the settlers that Alexander had left, had scattered in his newly conquered territories. We see here also 600 Hellenic and Thracian cavalry, which was flanked was even greater in number than the 400 Persian cavalry, which is, as we were saying before, you have basically of the native Persian element 400 cavalry and 10,000 lighter troops. Then we don't know if those other thousands of men of mixed origins how they would fight, right? But we see, and this is the impression I get, a kind of a more agile army than a typical phalanx, right? Something definitely with an overwhelming number of missile, right? Actually a few cavalry, and presumably, of course, some heavy infantry of some sort. The Agema was presumably like heavy infantry, but they are less than 300 men, right, that Peukestes used as bodyguards. So this is just the impression that I received. Speaking of cavalry, maybe something more in detail. No, the Persian cavalry, as you know, wasn't... say there was also an armored element, and here we are not to know how segmented this contingent was, nor about the Hellenic or Thracian one. The Persian cavalry may have actually been heavier in nature, especially certainly the Thracian one, because Thracian cavalry, of course, had a heavy element, but in general was mostly light. The Hellenic cavalry may have been something medium in nature, perhaps not as armored like the Persian one, but also the Persian one, yes, could have armor, was a big deal, but not near to anything cataphract, let's say, presumably. But surely there was some cataphract here and there, but one thing is having a core that is composed entirely by heavy cavalry. We have no evidence of this in the Diadochi army until Antiochus III, fundamentally. If not, maybe in areas like Bactria or towards the more Central Asian areas, we will see that, because they had, as a matter of fact. But in that case, those are part of a very heavily mixed club, as you understand. Here, Persian cavalry was, presumably something like medium, also more or less like the Hellenic one, perhaps slightly heavier, perhaps, but it's not to be seen. Surely there was also some degree of properly Macedonian troops that here we don't see exactly in which tactical style they would fight. Of course, there would be some heavy cavalry like the Etairoi, or the same phalangitic element, right? But again, don't think that even the Agema couldn't actually be trained to fight in any way. Right, and this is what more or less it showed, that they could at least reasoning by analogy with other armies, even in the ones that had maintained the greatest phalangitic tradition of all, which is in the case of Antigonid Macedon, specifically if you look at the numbers proper, over cavalry at least, that they could field, they could fight in different ways, even just as assault infantry. The same Peukestes knew something about that. So things were much more flexible than we think. And we don't know. We know that the same Peukestes took, literally took up Persian clothing in itself. And we could speculate that even some of his bodyguards were, as Macedons, would be maybe equipped in the local Persian way. Because, what the Macedonians found was a functional Persian administration that had its own depots, armories, things. So, by the way, what are you going to use in the first place? This is important to stress, in my opinion, because we have seen many times on the videos on the topic that the functionality of the phalanx stands in its numbers, right? In order to have a phalanx, you have to have some, at least some thousand men, right? You can't really make it work effectively if it's just less than that, and I don't think there is much evidence of anything like a phalanx army led by Peukestes, not even in the participation next to Eumenes. So these were all contingents that eventually the Diadochi were able to put together independently also from the phalanx. You see, the phalanx was at this time there were, of course, the same Macedonian veterans around who knew perfectly how to fight in one. The problem is how you levy and pay for it, because most of the conquerors were compensated with land, and the idea was that they should have, and they would indeed, keep up their own military service in case of need. The problem is putting that up literally in terms of costs, right? The Macedonian phalanx was something extremely expensive. Just to build the Sarissa, it was an enormous expense in terms of material cost. It was enormous, and to field it even more. So the smaller the power, and the less the need to actually, or the capacity even to levy a phalanx, and so it would have simply been easier to fight with these other forces that you had. A good example we have seen is the Pergamon, that in its military organization, even though it was close in between some, the Antagonids, the Celts, etc., never actually levied a phalanx, at least the Macedonian style, with pikemen and all, because it was useless, because you could have even a perfectly functional army without a phalanx. And Pergamon is a good example of that, but also the other Diadochi army that made use of the phalanx sided it to other troops, notoriously. I mean, look at the Seleucid armies, in fact, that were the most multicultural. That doesn't mean that there was a full integration of the native element with the the most kind of, with the Macedonian descent. This was sometimes where people called from places that were far away, even from the steppes, etc. So it was more a political grouping. The same goes for the Epirotes, that when facing the Romans and being worn out by losses, compensated by deploying Oskans interspersed in the phalanx, so as different sections that would just make it, some people say, more flexible. In my opinion, it was just because they didn't have enough men otherwise to hold the line. And much has been speculated on that. I talked about it in the video about the comparison between the confrontation, yes, between the Manipular Legion and Macedonian phalanx. The Antagonids, that had a hell of a infantry force, however, sometimes, look, in some battles, had half phalangites and half, those Balkanic medium light infantries that were needed to screen the phalanx, if anything, to pave its road, etc. So it was absolutely normal to conceive, even properly a battle line. So we're talking about properly heavy infantry. It was not phalangitic in nature still, and it was obvious because, again, you fight with what you have, right? It's not that you take the field with less men just because you want to have just phalanges. It doesn't exist as a concept in military history. There's none of that, and nobody. We have overly. It's not that we have, overestimated the Macedonian phalanx. It's that we have overestimated our technologism and let's say, exaggerated in the first place with our idea that it's just one type of tactics that makes even the same phalanx in itself. It's a mistake that is commonly done. Doesn't exist, right? The Macedonian tactics, that is different from the Hoplitic phalanx, stands in the fact that while the Hellenic Hoplitic phalanx fought just essentially with itself and a very few support, Macedonian army and tactics were so the phalanx itself was just an element, an arm of a combined tactics without cavalry did not work. So even the phalanx itself didn't make sense per se, right? It's not a formula that you just focus on the infantry and you say, that's what it made it great. No, it means that you don't basically understand anything about Philip II and Alexander's armies and one of their successors. It has nothing to do with that, because again, people are like children, that they think it's a video game where you have the type of unit that is stronger, has higher, lower values or bonuses, and then you don't even realize that the thing historically was conceived to act in function with other units, to be created conceptually in the first place. And so that's the thing, and that's dramatically, in fact, underestimated when people compared Roman legion or Macedonian phalanx, thinking that those were the only type of infantry confronting, or that they were the only type of arm confronting. So practically admitting that they have no idea of literally what the ABC of classical warfare is. So that's the impression I get from Peukestes armies as well, that they had a low phalangitic element, or at least probably also one of not of dramatic power, because not all phalanxes are the same. Phalanxes, like any other unit, are good if they are intensely trained and experienced, and of course the phalanx, in order to exist in the first place, has to be intensely trained. And again, you may not have the resources locally for that training, and so you just operate with something you have. If you have 10,000 Persian archers and slingers who presumably already know how to use their missile weapons by themselves, it's already a force that in field you can effectively integrate with something else, but it's imposing, and that's something that, as numerically considering the rest of the troops types that we've seen here, it's probably prevalent, and therefore this doesn't look like the typical Macedonian army in the first place. So yeah, that's my impression here, and which is probably also mirrored politically by this Persophilia that Peukestes was attributed. We don't know whether the man had a particular inclination towards the natives. Maybe he was a hardcore Macedonian traditionalist that couldn't govern Persis, but compromising with his position. But that surely reflects on the military level the fact that his army would be heavily Persian in nature, and so this is as if he had literally been an Achaemenid satrap rather than a Macedonian general at that point. Which is different from the other Diadocholes armies, and as we just said. So that's pretty much it. I would like to keep it short because it's mostly these concepts, I think, are important. We don't have, again, other information about Peukestes armies, and we will look, hopefully, with time allowing, at in much greater detail, because this Peukestes may be the least documented of these commanders in terms of what armies they fielded. And for now, however, stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.